welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into something that's been a really a fundamental shift in how the world works. Globalization. We've got some really interesting sources here, and they really dig deep into, what this all means.
Yeah.
Basically, it's about this increasing spread of ideas, knowledge, information, goods, services all across the globe.
Right.
But especially in terms of economics, it's how national economies are becoming so interconnected. Things like free trade and, moving capital around. It lets countries sort of tap into the best resources and the best sources of labor wherever they are in the world.
Well, and what's really fascinating to me is this underlying movement towards greater interaction and interdependence between countries, right?
Yeah.
It's being driven by a growing similarity in both cultural norms and economic systems.
Right.
So it's not just, stuff moving around.
Yeah.
It's this deepening reliance on each other as these systems start to resemble each other more and more.
Okay, so how does this actually play out in the real world?
Sure.
The basic idea is that countries start to specialize in what their best, their competitive advantages.
Right.
Whether that's efficient manufacturing or some kind of innovative technology.
Right.
And the theory is that this specialization then leads to, greater efficiency overall,
Yeah.
lower prices for everybody, and then broader economic growth worldwide.
Yeah.
So in principle, it sounds like a win-win.
It does, yeah. And, what really enables this are policies aimed at lowering the barriers between countries.
Yeah.
So you've got free trade agreements that reduce tariffs and regulations. You have more open border policies, and then just various forms of international cooperation.
Yeah.
And all these things together make it a lot easier for businesses to get cheaper inputs, to find the right workers, and reach much larger markets.
Yeah, it's all about making it easier
Right.
and faster.
Yeah.
It's accelerating the flow of everything. Money, finished products, raw materials, even information and people across national boundaries.
Right.
Faster than ever before.
Yeah.
And a huge catalyst for this has been the incredible progress in transportation and communication technologies.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're going to talk more about that.
No, absolutely. We're gonna dive into some of those specific technological advancements that have really sort of turbocharged globalization in just a minute.
Yeah.
Some of these, innovations have just totally changed how interconnected our world has become.
So that's the big picture. That's the overview.
Yeah.
We're going to take this deep dive into the what, the how, and the significance of globalization.
Right.
And we'll also be uncovering, some surprising historical stuff, some historical context.
Yeah.
So stick with us. All right. So let's talk about what I guess you could call the engine room of globalization. The technology that's made so much of this interconnectedness possible. First up, the internet. It feels almost too obvious to even mention it.
Yeah.
But when you really think about it, the explosion of the internet and just online communication in general, it's fundamentally changed how information and knowledge are shared around the world.
Yeah. You know what I think is really striking about the internet's role in cultural exchange is how quickly and kind of unexpectedly these niche cultural things from, one part of the world can suddenly have this huge global audience and even influence mainstream culture somewhere else. Think about the rise of K-pop or certain internet memes. Stuff that would have been unimaginable before everybody had internet access.
Right.
And then there's also this, ongoing effort to close that digital divide,
Right.
Offering more and more people access to this huge network of information
Right.
and resources.
And of course, we've seen this huge evolution in mobile networks. We went from 4G and now we're in the 5G world. And it's not just about, streaming movies faster on your phone.
No, not at all.
It's about changing the responsiveness and the connectivity of wireless networks, period.
Exactly. And while, faster downloads are nice, the real game changer with 5G, at least in a global context, is the incredibly low latency. It opens up all these possibilities for things like real-time remote diagnostics, even collaborative robotics across continents.
Wow.
So it really changes how global teams can work together
Right.
and manage these complex, operations from anywhere.
So it's not just about speed, it's about responsiveness.
Right.
Now, here's where things get really interesting, I think. The Internet of Things and artificial intelligence.
Right.
It's not just about, smart toasters and smart refrigerators anymore.
Right.
How are these technologies impacting the way we manage products that are constantly being shipped back and forth across borders.
Yeah, the core impact here is on efficiency.
Okay.
And it's through like sophisticated tracking and analysis. So you have these, IoT devices embedded in products, or shipping containers.
Hmm.
They're constantly sending back data about their location, their condition, as they're moving all over the world.
Okay.
And then AI steps in and analyzes all this data to optimize shipping routes, to predict delays,
Right.
maybe because of weather or logistical bottlenecks.
Yeah.
It just makes the whole process of moving stuff around the world much smoother and more cost-effective.
So it's like a global control center.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have this incredible visibility into global supply chains. Then we have
Yeah.
blockchain technology. It's been getting so much buzz.
Right.
How does that fit into all this?
Well, blockchain is mostly about, building trust and transparency in international transactions. It's this, decentralized, transparent ledger. It securely records and verifies transactions.
Okay.
Whether it's financial, like in banking,
Mm.
or related to, moving goods. This is especially valuable in things like healthcare,
Right.
where the integrity of records is absolutely critical.
Yeah.
And beyond financial transactions, blockchain's this decentralized database structure.
Okay.
It's being used to create these like unchangeable records for tracking goods through these really complex supply chains.
Right.
It offers this whole new level of accountability
Right.
and really reduces the possibility of fraud. There are, lots of benefits,
Yeah.
but some of the key ones are enhanced security, improved traceability,
Yeah.
and just increased efficiency in cross-border commerce in general.
So it's like creating a more secure foundation
Right.
for global commerce.
Mhm.
What about the actual like physical movement of goods and people?
Yeah.
What advancements have we seen there?
Yeah.
What's been key there?
Yeah, so that's where advancements in transportation come in. Think about just the sheer speed and efficiency of air travel
Yeah.
and high-speed rail,
Yeah.
Moving people across vast distances.
Yeah.
And on the cargo side, there's been huge advancements in, shipping logistics technology,
Hmm.
more sophisticated tracking, optimized routing,
Right.
the development of these massive cargo ships that are also more fuel efficient.
Right.
All of this is contributing to like a much faster and more efficient movement of raw materials, components, finished products all over the world.
It seems like both the digital and the physical infrastructure of globalization have just been like completely upgraded.
Right.
And finally, let's talk about manufacturing, automation, 3D printing, big changes.
Yeah.
How are these technologies reshaping like where things can be made?
Yeah, these are really, really transformative technologies. So automation in manufacturing, it just dramatically speeds up, production.
Yeah.
And allows for more flexibility. But even more revolutionary, I think, is 3D printing.
Yeah.
The fact that you can just send a digital design anywhere and then produce the physical object on demand means you can have smaller factories,
Right.
much closer to where your customers are.
Right.
And this distributed manufacturing model, I think it has huge potential to change the way we think about, these massive centralized factories
Right.
and these long, complex shipping routes.
Okay, so from the instant flow of information to
Yeah.
like almost on-demand production, close to home,
Right.
technology really is driving all this.
Yeah.
This incredible interconnected world. Okay, let's switch gears for a minute and talk about the bigger picture. What does globalization really mean, and what are its effects on our world?
Well, if you zoom out, globalization has fundamentally reshaped international economic activity, right?
Yeah.
It's not just about more trade, it's about developing these intricate global supply chains, where parts of a single product might cross multiple borders before it's even assembled. It also means businesses have easier access to a much wider range of, resources and labor,
Right.
all over the world.
And it's not just about the economics, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned cultural exchange earlier. How does globalization help that happen?
Right. Globalization lowers the traditional barriers of, distance,
Mm-hmm.
political boundaries, even different political and economic systems.
Right.
And it just enables this much greater exchange of ideas and values
Oh,
and
right.
cultural practices. People are exposed to different ways of life through travel,
Yeah,
the global reach of media,
right.
and just the wide range of, goods and services that they're able to buy,
Right.
they can consume.
Earlier, you talked about businesses being able to access resources in different countries. Can you give some specific examples of how that affects product development and supply chains?
Sure. When a company can source, say, raw materials
Mhm.
or specialized components from, anywhere in the world, it opens up all sorts of possibilities for innovation and product design. Okay.
The flip side is that managing these, geographically dispersed supply chains becomes much more complex.
Right.
You need, sophisticated logistics, communications, and a deep understanding of, different laws and regulations.
Right. It's more complex.
It is.
But it sounds like the reduction in trade barriers creates a lot of opportunity for companies to expand.
Yeah.
This increased competition must really drive innovation.
It does, absolutely. When you have businesses competing with, companies from all over the world,
Yeah.
they're constantly being pushed to innovate, to make their products better,
Mm,
and to find more efficient ways to do things.
right.
And all this competition also fosters a really important exchange of knowledge, technologies and best practices,
Yeah.
across borders.
Hmm.
And, as you said, the increased movement of people, it brings in all these new perspectives,
Right.
new cultural influences, which can be a real driver of innovation.
But of course, all this interconnectedness doesn't come without some downsides.
There are both, positive and negative consequences
Yeah, that's an important point.
to all this global integration.
Absolutely. While globalization can bring in fresh perspectives and, give businesses opportunities to grow, the increased movement of people and goods also has risks. Like a good example is the West Nile virus.
Okay.
The rise in international trade and travel in the late 20th century is probably what caused it to spread to new regions,
Really?
like North America,
Interesting.
possibly through, infected mosquitoes or travelers.
Wow.
Similarly, while the quick spread of information can be good, harmful ideas can also spread much more easily
Right.
in a globalized world.
Okay, so more opportunities, but also potentially more risks.
Right.
Now, I think a lot of people think of globalization as a pretty recent thing,
Yeah.
but it sounds like it actually has a much longer history.
It does. What's fascinating is that globalization, in one form or another, has been happening for centuries. It's not just a modern thing. Like, take the Roman Empire, for example. It started expanding around, 600 BC.
Right.
And for hundreds of years, it spread its economic systems, its laws, its form of government
Right.
across this vast territory. That was a significant form of globalization for its time.
And then there's, the classic example,
Hmm.
the Silk Road. It wasn't just about silk, though, was it?
No, not at all. The Silk Road, which flourished from around 130 BC to 1453 AD,
Okay.
it was another major wave of globalization. They weren't just routes for, trading silk and spices. They also facilitated the movement of merchants, religious beliefs,
I know.
technological innovations, even diseases spread along those routes
Yeah.
between the East and West. It was a really profound period of exchange.
And then jumping way ahead, there's the period just before World War I that people call a golden age of globalization.
Right.
What was happening then?
So in the decades leading up to World War I, from about 1870 to 1914, you had European powers making substantial overseas investments. There was a lot of economic interconnectedness, especially in terms of capital and trade. It's often remembered as a time when goods, capital, and even people could move pretty freely.
And after World War II, there was a conscious effort to establish a global economic order.
Right, exactly. Led by the U.S.,
Yeah.
the post-war period saw the creation of a global economic system, based on these agreed-upon rules and institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what led to the UN, the IMF, the World Bank,
Right.
and eventually the World Trade Organization,
Yeah.
all aimed at promoting cooperation and freer trade.
So they were setting the stage.
Exactly.
But the actual term globalization, that didn't really catch on until the 1980s, did it?
Right, yeah. The 1980s was when you started seeing the term globalization used widely,
Okay.
and it was largely driven by new technologies that really increased international interactions. The personal computer
Yeah.
introduced by IBM in 1981,
All
and
right.
then the development of the internet. Yeah.
These were pivotal. They made global communication, commerce, and just deeper integration
Right.
much easier.
And, like anything else, it hasn't been this straight upward trajectory.
Right.
There have been times when things have slowed down.
Absolutely. History always shows these, ebbs and flows,
Yeah.
expansion followed by, pulling back.
Right.
And we've seen it in the 21st century. Like
Yeah.
after 9/11, there was a dip in global stock markets. They did recover, though.
Mm-hmm.
More recently, you have these nationalist political movements,
Yeah.
they've led to some stricter immigration policies and more protectionist trade measures.
Right.
And then, of course, there was the pandemic,
Yeah.
border closures, supply chain disruptions.
Right.
But the overall trend in the early 21st century has been towards more global integration,
Right.
fueled by, technology and telecommunications.
It really is a long-term historical trend. So let's talk about some of the key players in all of this.
One that comes up a lot is the G20. What is that exactly?
The G20, it's
Oh.
the group of 20.
Okay.
It's a really important forum that brings together the world's biggest economies,
Okay.
both developed and developing. The main goal is to encourage cooperation on economic issues.
Right.
Things like financial stability, sustainable development, climate change.
Yeah.
It's made up of 19 countries, the EU,
Okay.
and recently the African Union has also become a member.
So it represents a pretty significant portion of, the world's population and economic power.
It does, yeah. The G20 countries together,
Yeah.
they account for about 80% of the world's population,
Wow.
about 75% of global exports,
Okay.
and about 85% of the world's GDP. It was created in 1999
Okay.
after the Asian financial crisis. And since 2008, they've been holding these annual summits where the leaders of these countries all get together.
Okay, so these summits where they talk about the really pressing issues.
Yeah.
Our sources mention some of the recent summit themes.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, the Rome Summit in 2021. What were some of the big things on the agenda there?
Yeah. So the Rome Summit,
Yeah.
it focused on a bunch of critical challenges,
Yeah.
like speeding up the response to climate change, dealing with the pandemic, vaccine distribution and stuff, promoting international tax cooperation,
Okay.
supporting the global economic recovery, and also increasing development aid to, struggling countries.
And then the next year in Bali, they had a similar set of issues to deal with, right?
Yeah, they did. The Bali Summit focused on things like energy security, strengthening, global health systems,
Okay.
sustainable industrial development, and economic stability in investment.
Yeah.
And they also had to deal with, the global consequences of Russia's invasion of Ukraine,
Yeah.
which was a huge economic issue.
And most recently, the summit in New Delhi continued these conversations.
That's right. The New Delhi Summit kept focusing on many of these challenges, with big emphasis on sustainable energy. They also talked about global economic stability and development. And it's worth noting that Spain is a permanent guest at these meetings.
Oh, interesting. So the G20 really is a place for high-level discussions.
Yeah.
And hopefully for coordinating international responses to, these shared problems.
Yeah.
Our sources actually break down globalization into different types. Can you walk us through those?
Yeah, we can think of it as having three main dimensions. Economic globalization, political globalization, and cultural globalization.
So let's start with economic globalization. What are the key features there?
Yeah, economic globalization is mainly about the integration of national economies
Okay.
through trade,
Right.
the flow of investment, and the interconnectedness of financial markets.
Yeah.
Like, think about those free trade agreements like NAFTA
Yeah.
or the TPP. They're all aimed at, reducing barriers to trade.
Right.
And then you have these multinational corporations. They have operations in tons of countries. And they're also driving this by, moving capital, technology, and goods across borders.
Right. So that's the movement of money and goods.
Yeah.
What about political globalization?
Yeah. Political globalization is about the growing cooperation and interaction between governments and the rise of international organizations
Yeah.
to address shared global challenges, like NATO or the UN.
Right.
These are examples of countries working together on issues, from security to, human rights.
And then finally, cultural globalization. I think this is probably what affects people the most directly.
Yeah, definitely. Cultural globalization is about the exchange and blending of, cultural ideas and practices all over the world.
Okay.
This is driven by technology and increased social interaction, the ease of communication
Right.
through the internet and social media
Yeah.
and greater access to travel.
Yeah.
It lets people experience different cultures firsthand.
So we've got economic, political, and cultural. These aren't, totally separate things, are they?
No, not at all. They're all interconnected.
Right.
For example, those free trade policies we talked about, that's a political decision.
Wow.
It directly affects economic globalization. Similarly, political agreements can make cultural exchange easier by making it easier to get visas or encouraging travel. And then on the other hand, economic globalization, through trade and media, it exposes people to other cultures.
Right.
And that drives cultural globalization.
It's this whole, feedback loop. So let's zoom in a little bit. How does globalization affect things at different levels? For individuals, for communities, and for bigger institutions?
Globalization has effects that are felt, at all levels of society. Like for individuals, it can mean easier access to more goods and services, often at lower prices. It also opens up opportunities for travel, education, and experiencing other cultures.
And what about at the level of, local communities? How does it change things closer to home?
Well, at the community level, it can lead to big changes. In local economies, what kinds of businesses do well, even demographics as people move around. Local cultures can evolve, too, as they mix with outside influences. Sometimes this is enriching. Sometimes it raises concerns about, things becoming too homogenous.
Right. It really changes the fabric of life.
Yeah.
What about for bigger things like multinational corporations or universities or governments?
Yeah, institutions are also deeply affected.
Okay.
Multinational corporations can grow and expand into new global markets. Universities, they can attract students and faculty from all over the world and engage in, research collaborations. Governments have to adapt their policies to deal with a more interconnected world. They have to address trade, migration, security.
It's complex.
It is. And assessing the overall impact, it's really tough. What one person might see as a positive outcome, another might see as negative. Like a trade deal that helps a big exporter might also lead to job losses, somewhere else. Whether globalization is ultimately good or bad for the world is a big debate. It depends on your perspective.
It's important to consider all the different angles. Can we talk about some real-world examples of globalization in action?
Yeah, sure.
Our sources highlight a couple of interesting areas.
Okay.
Like multinational corporations. Those are a very clear example of economic globalization.
Right. Like McDonald's, they're in, over 100 countries. They've adapted their menu and everything to local tastes. Or Ford. They have this huge global network of suppliers. And then there's Amazon, with sellers and employees all over the world. They all really show how interconnected things have become.
You mentioned that these companies also show some of the contradictions of globalization. How so?
Well, they can bring benefits.
Okay.
Creating jobs, introducing new technologies and skills, helping the economy grow. But they can also face criticism.
Okay.
Maybe they displace local businesses, or they go to developing countries for cheaper labor, or they influence local cultures through, advertising and stuff. Their main responsibility is to their shareholders. So sometimes their decisions might not be in the best interest of, the local communities.
It's a tough balance.
It is.
What's another example of globalization?
Well, the global response to the pandemic.
Okay.
That's a really good example. The quick development and sharing of information, that was crucial. And we even saw, countries helping each other, sending healthcare workers, supplies, to those in need.
But the pandemic also showed some of the vulnerabilities, right?
It did. All those border closures, travel restrictions. It really disrupted things. That free movement of people and goods is a key part of globalization. So the pandemic showed both the good and bad sides of being so interconnected.
It's like a microcosm of globalization.
Yeah.
Let's talk more about the pros and cons. What are some of the arguments in favor of globalization?
People who support globalization argue that it's a good way to solve global economic problems. It makes it easier to move resources, capital, labor to where they're needed. It encourages free trade, which can lead to, economic growth, more jobs, more competition, lower prices. For developing countries, globalization can bring in investment, new technology, new markets, which can help improve living standards.
Yeah.
Some argue that more global interaction can even be good for, human rights and the environment, because of more international scrutiny, sharing best practices. And then, of course, travel and experiencing other cultures
Yeah.
that can promote understanding.
Those are really strong arguments.
Yeah.
But what about the criticisms? What are some of the negative consequences?
Well, critics of globalization are worried about a few things, like reducing trade barriers
Yeah.
and making it easier to move capital and labor.
Yeah.
They argue that Purdue can destabilize markets, undermine national policies,
Okay.
and erode local cultures.
Right.
Labor markets in developed countries are particularly affected.
Okay.
Jobs might be outsourced
Yeah.
and people might migrate.
Mm-hmm.
There are also big concerns about the environment.
Right.
All the transportation, the emissions, invasive species, unsustainable resource exploitation.
Oh, yeah.
Some people argue that globalization can even lower living standards in developed countries because of, wages not keeping up or job losses.
Right.
The interconnectedness of global markets can also make economic crises spread faster.
Yeah, we saw that in 2008.
Exactly. Critics also worry about losing unique cultures and languages. Because of these dominant global forces, the internet and social media can really accelerate that.
Yeah.
And as we talked about with the pandemic, more travel means diseases can spread more easily.
A lot to consider.
It is.
This has led to a sort of counter movement, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Deglobalization. What is that exactly?
Deglobalization is basically a trend where countries become more skeptical of, all this global integration